Hello everyone, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching this video on Guide to Legal History and Historians, where we will be covering chapters and historians from the Oxford Handbook of Legal History, edited by Marcus D. Dubber and Christopher Tollins. Today we will be covering two chapters from Section 3, Perspectives, Legal History in Modern Legal Thought, chapters 21 on Jeremy Bentham, living from the years 1748 to 1832, and the chapter is by Philip Schofield, and chapter 22, Historical Jurisprudence, by Mathias Reimann. So please, if you've not watched the previous videos, these do not need to be watched in order. There's a caveat in this Oxford Handbook of Legal History that they're not in chronological order or almost in any real order for that matter at all, so feel free to watch them in reverse order or jump around. It's all up to you based on your interests or which particular scholars you wish to follow. So without further ado, we will begin with that of the chapter and biography of Philip Schofield, and in the style of Plutarch's Lives we will have a comparison at the end, because that's where I think you can at least learn the most about the individuals, even though they are not actual directly contradict each other. There's still a lot we can learn through their two different scholarships followed in tandem. So without further ado, we will start with Philip Schofield. So about a little biography of Philip Schofield to start. He's a professor of history and legal and political thought at the University College London, Faculty of Laws. He's teaching an LLM course, a Master of Law course called Jeremy Bentham and the Utilitarian Tradition. He's also the director of the Bentham Project and also the general editor of the collected works of Jeremy Bentham. He received his Bachelor of Arts with honors from the University of Manchester in 1980, and he also received a postgraduate certificate in education from the Manchester Polytechnic University in 1984, as well as a PhD at the University of London in 1984, as well as an LLM in 1989 from the University College London as well. Some of his notable books are Utility and Democracy, The Political Thought of Jeremy Bentham, published by the Oxford University Press in 2006, the same as the Oxford Handbook of Legal History. And this book actually received the W.J.M. Mackenzie Book Prize in 2006 and from the Political Studies Association. As well, he wrote Bentham, A Guide for the Perplexed, which is a continuum, published by Continuum in 2009. Some highlights, and this book highlights the relevance of contemporary topics: logic and language, utilitarianism, legal theory, panoptic prism, democratic politics, and views on religion, sex, and torture. As well, he's since 2021 written 3 additional books as well, and I don't doubt he'll write more in the future, if we're fortunate enough. He's also the Secretary of International Society for Utilitarian Studies, and where he organizes major international conferences in locations such as London, Lucca, New York, Yokohama, Lille, and Karlsruhe. He has a total of 123 publications, books and non-books, and his interests include legal history, utilitas economics, logic and language, political fallacies, sexual morality, history of political thought, history of European ideas, and as well, of course, Jeremy Bentham, which will be the primary topic of this chapter. So without further ado, we'll go through his chapter titled Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832, the Oxford Handbook of Legal History. So the part 1 starts with this opening. Since the late 1960s, Bentham's scholarship has been driven by the appearance of volumes in the new authoritative edition of the collected works of Jeremy Bentham, prepared by the Bentham Project, which he heads, under the University College London's Bentham Committee, and the successive general editorships of J. H. Burns from 1861 to 1979, J. R. Dinwiddie, who lived from 1978 to 1983, and F. Rosen, who lived from 1983 to 2003, and the present author, Philip Schofield from 1955 onward. So University College London, if you're fascinated in Jeremy Bentham, would probably be the place to study it, perhaps in the form of an LLM, for example. They're now on the 33rd volume in edition, entitled Preparatory Principles, was published in December of 2016, and the University College London possesses not only Bentham's physical remains in the form of his auto icon, but also his literary remains in the form of around 60,000 folios of his manuscripts. A further 12,500 are deposited in the British Library, and the earliest attempt at a major edition of Bentham's writings had been undertaken within a decade or so of his death by his literary executor, John Bowrings. So scholarship's pretty much started right after his death and has continued up until the present. And it seems, at first sight, to be quite steady as well, but we'll see more later. By the 1930s, the Bowring edition was judged to be unsatisfactory as a basis for modern scholarship, so the University College London established the first incarnation of the Bentham Committee with a view to produce an authoritative edition. However, there was little progress between World War II, due to, obviously, the war, and Werner Stark, a Czech refugee, was working under the auspices of John Maynard Keynes, prepared a 3-volume edition of Bentham's economic writings, which was eventually published in the early 1950s. So there was still some scholarship going on, but kind of hidden through the efforts of this Czech refugee, Werner Stark. And through the encouragement of A.J. Ayer, the second incarnation of the Bentham Committee was established in 1959, and the first 2 volumes were published in 1968, and the 12th was published in 2006. So quite steady, with a little small stop in terms of Bentham scholarship during World War II. So he also has this quote: "Why does the Bentham edition matter? The short answer is because Bentham matters." The 19th century utilitarian philosopher Henry Sigwart claimed that Bentham was the preeminent representative of the Enlightenment, and that Benthamism was the legacy left to the 19th century by the 18th, being the force against which the new philosophy of restoration and reaction had to struggle continually with varying success. The 18th century Bentham, influenced by the radical Enlightenment of Helvetius, Voltaire, d'Alembert, and Diderot, seeing on the one hand the emergence of a stable democracy in America, and on the other hand the experiencing mistreatment at the hands of the British establishment over his panopticon prison scheme, developed into a politically radical Bentham of the 19th century, advocating at first a democratic ascendancy within the British Constitution, and then a democratic republic, stripped of monarch aristocracy and established church. And it took a radical program for parliamentary reform, with its demands for universal suffrage, secret ballot, equal electoral districts, and annual elections, and its traditional basis either in natural rights or the Anglo-Saxon constitution. And it also used a utilitarian justification which paved the way, if not for the Great Reform Act of 1831, certainly for the People's Charter of 1848. J.H. Burns says Bentham's career moved from radical enlightenment to philosophic radicalism, political, legal, and ecclesiastical reform, which at the same time aimed at promoting the interests of the community as a whole without threatening the security of property. So very influential, but I think my main takeaway here was that he was in part influenced by that which was going around in democracy in America. And one of my favorite books of all time is precisely that, Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. But we also have to assume, and it is likely true, that Bentham also perhaps influenced the United States as well, but perhaps to a lesser degree, as we saw perhaps in Blackstone in the previous episode. In terms of historical significance, so Bentham has both a historical significance and a political importance, as he was the founder of doctrine of classical utilitarianism, and he remains one of the main strands of liberal moral philosophy. That's classical utilitarianism. His philosophic calculus is the basis for cost-benefit analysis in economics, so incredibly large influence in economics as well. He set the parameters for the modern discipline of jurisprudence, as we'll see in the next chapter. We'll talk quote, historical jurisprudence, and he did this by distinguishing law as it is from law as it ought to be, offering a profound critique of the natural law of the English common law, and proposing a whole range of legal reforms. So perhaps as we might differ from the previous intellectual who was covered in the previous episode, Blackstone did perhaps a lesser degree of actual reforms. The commentary as well, he had a commentary on the French Declaration of Rights in 1789, so influence on France as well, with the memorable phrase, "nonsense upon stilts," which is his characterization of the French Declaration of Rights, and it constitutes a devastating attack on the philosophy of natural rights, and hence on man's rights. And he put forward perhaps the most radical vision of the democratic state ever devised, and it looms large in studies of surveillance thanks to Michael Foucault's account of the panoptical prison as a model for the modern state. So it's almost, as we see, hinges on, as in later years, particularly the radical side. Michael Foucault wrote, "Bentham is more important for our society than Kant and Hegel," not or, and influenced in respective fields as well Judith Resnick, John Elster, Faramaz, Hawiwala, and David Armitage. As general editor of the Bentham Committee, that is the author here, Philip Schofield, he received support from the Economic and Social Research Council, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Leverhulme Trust, the Wellcome Trust, the Mellon Foundation, and the European Research Council, as well as a modest grant from the British Academy. It has growingly and importantly brought scholars in-house as well, in an attempt to link projects with funding. This is his objective. He wants grants have been short-term, however, which has caused limitations, and this is contrasted to the Averroes edition at the University of Cologne. I also have prepared a video on Averroes. But basically what he is saying is that the University of Cologne, the Averroes edition, has continual and longer term funding, which allows it a little bit more academic freedom. So that's kind of something he's kind of calling out to the readers here, and perhaps the listeners as well here. Whereas in the University of Cologne, the Averroes edition received funding for 25 years, and he said it would be best to begin with guaranteed endowment to allow intellectual freedom, allowing work to proceed on a chronological basis, so you can start from the beginning, not just focusing on the end results immediately. As well, general editors can concentrate on editing rather than on fundraising, so once they've made the money, they don't have to be fundraisers, they can actually focus on scholarship. And this challenge of supporting long-term research products is one of that, he says, the British Academia has failed to meet. So, without further ado, we'll continue into the part 2 of his chapter. That was the introduction, kind of covering most of what we'll talk about. So he says, the relationship of the new edition and interpretive scholarship, the first volumes of works were concerned with Bentham's early law and legal philosophy. So this is the earlier books on Bentham, and they took advantage of the fact that one of the scholars in an appropriate field to take serious interest in editing Bentham was the prominent Oxford legal philosopher H.L.A. Hart, who we've heard referenced many times, a very important Oxford scholar, legal scholar particularly. And H.L.A. Hart saw that as the originator of the doctrine of legal positivism as well, which he drew, as we see, much from Bentham. Himself gave a standard account in the concept of law in 1961, and his essays on Bentham, published in 1982. Much attention has, on the whole, been paid to Bentham's later writing, however, though Rosen's writing on the Constitutional Code are a notable exception, so there seems to be a sort of a bias towards Bentham's earlier writings, and perhaps that's because H.L.A. Hart was most influenced by them, as well as distinguish clearly between law as it is as law as it ought to be, that is, his legal positivism. In this distinction appeared to map onto the 20th century distinction between fact and value, or description and prescription, or Hart's The Concept of Law, in The Concept of Law, his book, Nature of Law as It Is, and Goodness of Content of Law as It Ought to Be. So that is something that did come from Bentham's later work that had influenced modern-day scholarship, including H.L.A. Hart, so not completely derived from the older works. The author began to have doubts about Hartler's approach, the author being Philip Schofield, however, in that when working on the manuscripts of Bentham's essays on ontology and then on Bentham's writing on logic more generally, on which ontology formed a part. Bentham's understanding of ontology and epistemology did not seem compatible with conceptual analysis as was understood by Hart in the 20th century philosophers. So the author here, Philip Schofield, thinks that maybe H.L.A. Hart either misused or misunderstood Jeremy Bentham's thoughts on ontology. Doubts further have been raised in the author's mind by a paper given by the late Amanda Peru, where she argued that Bentham was not a legal positive in the Hartian sense, and he also discovered a number of transcription errors of the laws in general, not listed in the core agenda to that edition. So there were errors that were not recorded, so there's a couple of strange things going on here, and Amanda Peru openly called out his that legal positivism was distinctly different from Hart's. This has been presented to the Bentham Committee, and they wonder whether Hart chose the title of laws in general, a phrase that appears to be related to the manuscript but was not intended by Bentham as a new title for limits, because it seemed to link Bentham's work to his own theory of law by presenting it as an exercise in conceptual analysis. If that were the case, it would have been akin to putting the cart before the horse, so it was kind of maybe, once again, misusing Jeremy Bentham's work, that is H.L.A. Hart. Hart would have allowed his own philosophical views to influence the way he had edited the historical text. So that is an important aspect of the modern Bentham scholarship. So after concerns with the standard of the Hartian interpretation as a legal positivist and distortions in the way in which Hart approached editing on the laws in general, they began thinking about the relationship between Bentham's legal theory and more generally the principle of utility on the other hand, and on his writings on logic and language, or more generally on ontology and epistemology on the other hand. So once he discovered these discrepancies in Hart's works, he he started exploring how there might be discrepancies in those of others, and in different aspects of Bentham scholarship. Furthermore, Philip Schofield is perplexed by the fact that ontology and epistemology were generally referred to as Bentham's theory of fictions, a description which seems to have originated with Charles K. Ogden, who republished Bowring's edition of the relevant manuscripts in the 1930s. An assumption that fictions and what Bentham termed fictitious entities amount to the same thing has produced and continues to produce confusion in Bentham's scholarship. So it's kind of perhaps a misuse of the word, which is Bentham's fictitious entities. A fiction for Bentham was a false statement of fact, while a fictitious entity was an abstraction, which we'll explain further below. Further skepticism of Hart's interpretation of Bentham's strengthened by work undertaken on the preparatory principles. And this volume had its genesis over 40 years ago, as of this date. It's 2023, if I'm not sure when you're watching this, when Douglas Long began, or when this was recorded, when Douglas Long began the process of producing pioneering encoded transcript of the manuscripts using computer developed at the University of Western Ontario. So they started using technical analysis or computer analysis of Bentham's works to really get to the crux of these issues. And what they did was they divided into chapters and sections following a coherent structure, and it consists of a series of numbered passages, probably written over 3 or 4 years in the mid-1770s, in which Bentham noted ideas as and when they occurred to him. So they're taking his journals and really kind of categorizing them through text analysis. And as well, it is chronological too, so you can see the change of Bentham over time, and multiple passages dealing with ontology and language, so address these discrepancies as well. And as well, through this we can piece together Bentham's views and contrast them with Hart. And once the centrality of Bentham's philosophy and language has been recognized, which he notes hasn't been done so, scholars will not only be able to reassess his writing on jurisprudence, but also develop a more complete understanding of his voluminous later writings on codification in general, on the penal, civil, and constitutional codes in particular, on procedure and evidence, and everything else besides, he says. So, essentially, there's you notice some discrepancies in the way even Hart, one of the earliest Bentham scholars, interpreted his work. So he's gone through the work and is and he would endeavor to do it in a chronological way. He's hired people in-house, scholars. However, their funding is limited, but they're using this technical analysis to perhaps expedite it, but also do it as most accurately as possible. Moving to section 3, one of the main themes, he says, in Preparatory Principles, which is one of the books written by Jeremy Bentham, is the term metaphysics, by which he meant philosophy of language, and which was the subject matter of universal jurisprudence. The business of metaphysics is, this is according to Jeremy Bentham, to examine what ideas we have belonging to the terms we use, and whether they are clear or no, or not, it would be in modern tense. Every science had its leading terms, which were used in order to make other terms understand. I think of this as like first principles, like most necessary words. This is Bentham's definition of metaphysics. And metaphysics of science of law consisted in ascertaining the meaning and fixing the ideas belonging to the several terms of particular jurisprudence through the median of which the technical terms of a particular jurisprudence of any country are endeavored to be explained. So he had in mind such terms as right, duty, and power. So these would be examples of the metaphysics of these first principles in terms of words, the words that cannot be defined by ordinary Aristotelian method per genus, a differentium, so by its class or by differentiation. So duty is, you cannot really define it further down, for example, or power. This in itself was an extraordinary insight, Schofield, and we shall perhaps never know how Bentham arrived at it, so because it didn't come necessarily from Aristotle, for example. The answer may lie, however, buried in some of the yet transcribed manuscripts, so there might still be an opportunity to figure this out. The task of giving expositions of these terms belonged to the field of universal jurisprudence. We're looking at historical jurisprudence in the next biography. And what then was universal jurisprudence, and how were we to make sense of the key terms? In the second section of limits, so limits came after preparatory principles, Bentham distinguished three branches of jurisprudence. Censorial jurisprudence ascertained what the laws ought to be, or local. Expository jurisprudence ascertained what the law is in a particular group of nations. And universal, or expository jurisprudence, which was relevant to all nations whatsoever, dealt with the words appropriated to the subject of law, which in all languages are pretty exactly correspondent to another, or of this term. So there's kind of like the local vocabulary, and then there's the transcendent or transnational jurisprudence, which are like laws that would be common across states. I think a good study of this would be Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws, where he studies that different laws are actually necessary for different people and even perhaps in different climates. Which, for example, on this term, he uses this quote, in all languages are pretty exactly correspondent with others are those which correspond with the words of power, right, obligation, liberty, and many others. So those first principle words are also those transnational words as well. Like there cannot be an alternate definition of power in different countries. It's got the same meaning, but you can't really explain what it is. The subject matter of universal jurisprudence was the import of words to be, strictly speaking, universal. It must confine itself to terminology, and therefore, according to Bentham, each legal system had terms for entities that could be found in every legal system. So if it's only found in one legal system, then it's not one, it doesn't qualify. He explicitly followed John Locke in stating that ideas consisted of the several objects we are said to have in our mind when we are thinking, and he also followed David Hume in distinguishing ideas into ideas properly so called and impressions. Bentham followed Locke's simple ideas and mixed modes, simple ideas derived from bodies, and in his An Introduction to the Principles of Moral Legislation, or IPML, because it's such a long name we might refer to later, or I might keep reading it out, we'll see. Only complex ideas can be defined, and no higher genus for some terms, and therefore per genus a differentium. So basically there's only complex ideas can be defined, but the most foundational cannot. Furthermore, he has noun substantives, which are proper and improper, former names of real entities are proper noun substantives, and the latter names of fictitious entities improper. So, for example, house versus, well, happens to be two words, but White House, or house and, for example, Parliament with a capital P. And therefore, the later requires compounding in a sentence to get meanings. So, for example, house. It's an abstract term, but you say John's house, for example, or Philip's house, then it's got a meaning. And therefore, it sought a chain of definitions, and this is what you call periphrasis. Term is a term given which is a technique invested in order to expound the terminology of the universal jurisprudence. And use the quote, to expound an improper substantive by periphrasis is to complete it in a sentence, and for that sentence to find equivalent sentence consisting of words significative of real entities. And it is by periphrasis and periphrasis alone that fictitious entities expressed by improper substantives can be expounded. So only through this, by putting it in a sentence, can it be explained. Words like for and right are examples, and benefits an end to disputes of law. So if by doing this, by putting in a sentence, one of the benefits is it could end disputes of law, as opposed to questions of fact. So not debating on what it is once put in a sentence. So once you know it's John's house, then we can define it. And there's a quote, all questions of law are more than questions concerning the import of words, so therefore they must be directly defined. And sensible communication would be established between jurists of different nations by banishing as many as we can spare of the terms peculiar to our own local jurisprudence. So he's advocating for this universal diction. Furthermore, by banishing as many as we can spare of the terms peculiar to our own local jurisprudence, and giving a clear and steady exposition of such as we are obliged to retain in the terms of universal jurisprudence, an easy and profitable intercourse may be kept between the jurists of the several nations. So it's kind of got a globalist objective. And an Englishman might read a comment upon his own laws in the language of Spain or Sweden. And the third benefit, he says, by giving periphrasis of the various names of fictitious legal entities, Bentham would not only be able to use the terms in his own work, but would also be able to clarify their meaning when used by other writers. So very, very important stuff, and I think it's no coincidence that for example, the Oxford Dictionary, they always have it in a sentence too. You can't just describe some of these things without putting them in a sentence. This is not involved in the form of conceptual analysis that would give rise to the morally neutral legal terms, as Hart suggested. And he said there is no morality in neutrality, and therefore there must be some utility. So that's where he differs from H.L.A. Hart, and that's why perhaps there might be evidence that Hart either misunderstood or misdescribed Bentham. And a person would not embark on the enterprise of universal jurisprudence if they did not anticipate some value from the activity. So there's sort of an utilitarian, and that's why Bentham differs from some of the other famous legal scholars or important legal scholars, in that he actually had objectives in mind, and in this it seems he's quite a globalist. Moving to section 4. So it limits was the last book, and it stopped at the length. So at the end of the book length of limits, at the start of the introduction of the principles of morals and legislation, so IPML came after limits. He found himself, but limits is a full-size book, but his kind of last work is the principles of morals and legislation, or IPML, which is with introduction in front. And he found himself expectantly entangled in unsuspected corner of a metaphysical maze. So perhaps he went a little bit too far down this rabbit hole. And he said in the preface, and he said this in the preface, in fact, and perhaps explaining the distinction between penal and civil law was the crux of where he found these challenges. And this was a challenge that was even put forward previously in Limits, where he distinguished complete versus incomplete laws, while different subject matters of law and English law, where punishment for penal or criminal offense was regarded either more severe or more disreputable for civil, so they were seen as two different things. However, Bentham came to recognize it as a logical it as a logical distinction in that every single and complete law had both a penal and civil element, and furthermore a precedent element. So that's a completely profound and different way of looking at it. So there's a penal and civil law, and if you think of, for example, I talk a lot about Alexis de Tocqueville. In the end, he says that the Roman law was all civil law, or was all like a slave law. Perhaps it was because it was missing this other portion, the penal element, so the criminal element. So civil element, how people deal with each other, and then there's the criminal, or the penal element, how the state deals with them. And he says, as Jeremy Bentham says, they're not mutually exclusive, essentially. And constitutional law has been made up of a combination of both civil and penal laws, so now there seems to be a synergy here. And it fell into the overall plan, and hence a self-standing penal code without a civil and procedural codes would make no sense, nor would a self-standing civil code. So he said, Alexis de Tocqueville said Germany had no civil code, and as we've seen in previous chapters, it almost maybe perhaps let it ripe for authoritarianism. Furthermore, he spent a great deal of time reworking his ideas on the fundamental questions when he was visiting his brother Samuel in Russia. So he also had an influence in Russia, but also was influenced in Russia, and he was visiting there from 1785 to 1788, so for 3 years. And he had unfulfilled hopes of presenting a penal code to the Empress Catherine II, where he wanted to create a complete code, or called a panomium, to a province of the Roman Empire bounded by the the word panomium originally refers to a province in the Roman Empire which was bounded by the north and east by the Danube. So, but this complete code he wanted to call that name. And furthermore, he also wrote to James Madison in 1811, emphasizing the principle of utility and cognoscibility, and whatever practical good effect arose from the matter of law, no matter how excellent itself, would depend on the law's cognoscibility, so it must be understood, and capable of being judicially determined, is the definition of cognoscibility. And therefore, it must have both matter and form. So as we see, he did endeavor to influence Catherine the Great into creating a civil code that combined both penal and civil, as well as the procedural aspect. And also he did write to James Madison too, so we can also see that James Madison was one of the writers of the Federalist Papers, which I advocate anyone interested in law or history should read. It's amazing, and it kind of documents how the Constitution came to be, and kind of argues for, like, well, not argues for it, argues against any argument that's against it. So it's a really profound way of writing. So by like shutting down all the criticisms, it's really great reading. But nonetheless, Jeremy Bentham also had an influence on James Madison. So as we can see in the United States Constitution, the fact that it has both civil and penal aspects would make it in alignment with Jeremy Bentham's philosophy. So moving to the final section, section 5. Says, while certain fundamental features appeared early and remained constant in Bentham's thought, such as ontology and commitment to the principle of utility, there were other developments and refinements over time, as he worked out the implications of these foundations in the light of the changing circumstances. So it's important to note the particular historical context in which Bentham wrote. The same thing applied to the previous section on Blackstone, where it's important to note the context they wrote, the political climate as well, and in particular the provenance and intended audiences for the particular writings that are under scrutiny, so also who he's writing them for. For example, he had a well-known attack on the French Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1780, as previously mentioned, and yet he advocated for a similar document in Tripoli in 1822. So on one hand, he's criticizing it in France, and then in favor of it a few years later in Tripoli. And on the face, this seems inconsistent, but it's also warning against presenting Bentham as timeless thought system. So once again, advocating for doing this chronological analysis of Bentham. But it's rather a matter of utility, however, because the information and opinions do change over time. So, but nonetheless, I think he was right in both stands, or at least he believed himself to be right. But it's a matter of utility. Maybe the rights code in Tripoli made more sense, but the one in France didn't, and it's the political climate. It's not necessarily that Bentham cannot make his mind up, but it's a matter and an example of utility. And a second example is in his conversation to political realism in the first decade of the 19th century. Through the emergence of notation of a sinister interest in central feature in his thought, he had an anachronistic to explain the thinking in 1770s and 1780s by reference to a sinister interest, but it's impossible to understand in the 1810s and 1820s without it. So the importance of legal history, there is much to be gained, he says, to both historical and philosophical disciplines by appreciating legal thought in its own context. So essentially, on his conversations of political realism, he goes from saying it's bad to being in favor to being almost unclear. But nonetheless, it's, I think, an emphasis of utilitarianism. Sometimes maybe legal realism does make sense, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it kind of does. And also, critical perspective as own practices and beliefs need to be analyzed, and as they change over time. Only the first volume of Constitutional Code published in the collected works, so he's saying there's a shortage and that only the earliest scholarship was covered, only his first volume of Constitutional Code, and thousands of pages of relevant manuscripts as well as printing, writing published and unpublished on other topics are still yet to be discovered. So the point he's really making here is advocating for his scholarship in that there's a serious bias, particularly for the earlier information, and the fact that Bentham has changed over time, or his ideas did change over time, makes it necessary that further analysis into his scholarship be done. Furthermore, not including the political economy, panopticon, parliamentary reform, and religion. So these are also very important topics that have not been fully analyzed, both early and late in his career. There's perhaps 20 volumes of these alone. So far, 4 volumes in the 1770s and early 1780s, and half a dozen from the 1810s and 1820s, which contribute significantly to the understanding of Bentham's legal theory and codification, have still yet to be analyzed. The next batch the author would like to appear in collected works, resources permitting, he says, consists of project form and project matière, française, so form and material, and form and way, and Bentham's scholarship is highly contingent and will remain so until many more volumes appear in collected works. So right now, even if you were to read all the scholarship to date, it would not be a full picture of Bentham. The new edition of Limits, for example, started a process of the re-evaluation of Bentham's Jurisprudence, while the new preparatory principles will fuel this process. When the projet materials are eventually published, there will be an occasion for further re-evaluation, and there is a promise of an amazing wealth of materials still to come. So if you're interested in the work of Philip Schofield, or specifically Jeremy Bentham, this would be the place to do it, and there's still much to be done. And although Bentham has had great many influences, particularly my favorite is the combination of the penal and civil code in constitutions, there's still much to be done, particularly in his later works and those in particular subject matters. So that is the chapter by Philip Schofield, and we will now briefly talk about his slide, and then we will move to the chapter by Mathias Reimann. So his institution is the University College London Faculty of Laws. His position is Professor of the History of Legal and Political Thought. His research interests include Jeremy Bentham, Utilitas, economics, logic and language, political fallacies, sexual morality, history of political thought, history of European ideas. Some suggested readings include Jeremy Bentham and Australia, Convicts, Utility and Empire, published by the University College London Press in 2022, Panopticon versus New South Wales and Other Writings on Australia, published by the University College London Press in 2021, and Utility and Democracy, the Political Thought of Jeremy Bentham, published by the Oxford University Press in 2006. Moving to, so once again, his chapter is in section 3, Perspectives, Legal History in Modern Legal Thought. Chapter 21, Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832. And in terms of the logos, we have in the bottom right, the University of Manchester, bottom left, Manchester Polytechnic University. In the top right, we have the University of London logo, and then in the top, we have University College London logo. In terms of some quotes by Philip Schofield, not by Jeremy Bentham. Why does the Bentham edition matter? The short answer is because Bentham matters. as well as historical, next quote, as well as historical significance, Bentham's thought continues to be of philosophical importance. So it's both historical importance but also philosophical importance, because there's still much to be learned. There is much, next quote, there is much to be gained both to historical and to philosophical disciplines from appreciating Bentham's legal thought in its own context, and in particular by viewing it in relation to his own views on ontology and epistemology, which he says are perhaps areas that he has been more constant. Last quote, once we adopt a historically focused approach to Bentham, the questions will then revolve around the nature of utilitarian jurisprudence rather than around the nature of legal positivism. So that is the chapter by Philip Schofield. And without further ado, we'll go to the chapter by Mathias Reimann. So once again, this is in section 3, Perspectives, Legal History in Modern Legal Thought. His chapter is chapter 22 in the Oxford Handbook of Legal History, titled Historical Jurisprudence. Once again, his name and the chapter is by Mathias Reimann. So a little bit quickly to discuss his quick biography. He's the Hessel E. Yesma Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School, one of the top 14 law schools in the United States. He also was at the University of Freiburg, Germany, which is in the southwest of Stuttgart, near France, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, so it's in the southwest. So you can see that it's important. Germany is a very big country, and there are different backgrounds that are necessary to understand. And he received his referendar in 1978 and assessor in 1981. In University of Michigan, he received his Master of Law in 1983, and then he went back to University of Freiburg to receive his PhD. He taught for several years at the Freiburg University, and he publishes widely in the U.S. and abroad in comparative law, private international law, and legal history. He also held visiting appointments in France, Italy, Japan, Israel, Germany, and Australia, so very well traveled and very quite influential. His recent courses include gun control, international litigation, jurisdiction and choice of law, and transnational law. His areas of interest include international and comparative law, as well as legal history. His books include comparative law. He's also interested in litigation as well. His book chapters include legal commentaries in the United States Division of Labor, published in the Justice Commentaire, published by the Ein International by Verglich in 2020, as well as some book reviews, such as A Bottom-Up View of Legal Transplants, published in the American Journal of Comparative Law in 2020. And some of his books include the International Encyclopedia of Comparative Law, published by Brill Nijoff in 2020, and he was also an editors with Reinhard Zimmermann in the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Law, published by the Oxford University Press in 2006. So without further ado, we will talk about this chapter, and we'll talk more about him, his background, and his comparison with Philip Schofield. So in terms of his introduction, he titles it Defining the Terrain. So he opens with this quote, historical jurisprudence marked by judges who consider history, tradition, and custom when deciding a legal dispute. So, and that's, sorry, pardon me, that's not his quote, that's the definition of historical jurisprudence by law.jrank. I'll say that again. Historical jurisprudence is marked by judges who consider history, tradition, and custom when deciding a legal dispute. So, he opens up with historical jurisprudence treated law as inevitably a product of the past. Of course, jurists have long recognized that the law, like other social phenomenon, has history. But for historical jurisprudence, that history was not merely the background of the status quo, but instead an integral part of its present study. So what it kind of is looking into history to derive the answers of the present. All legal historians, furthermore, he says, have explored laws past, but historical jurisprudence, for historical jurisprudence, legal history is not an end in itself. Instead, it is a principal means through which even present-day law must be understood. In short, the movement saw law as essentially historical phenomenon, which could be properly grasped only in light of its origins and genesis. So, kind of something I'm quite fascinated. That's why I'm fascinated in legal history, is I do think that some answers at least can be answered through studying the past. It's largely a 19th century phenomenon, according to Mathias Reimann, and it must thus be seen in context of the times in at least three regards. First, it was part of the century's turn to history across most of the humanities. Historical jurisprudence was the legal version of a much broader trend. Second, it was based on the then emerging modern concept of science, which renounced philosophical speculation and deductive reasoning from absolutes, and which required the knowledge to be instinctively derived from observation and positive data. So there's also a big science movement affecting it. And thirdly, it reacted against earlier and contemporary approaches which regarded law either as timeless and logical system, or known as natural law, or simply as a command of the sovereign, analytical jurisprudence. And it defined itself not only by turning to historical research, but also by turning against both the discussion of abstract logic and search for legislative will. Some precursors, notwithstanding, historical jurisprudence first arose in the Germanic Romantic era in the early 19th century and lasted until it was gradually superseded by the sociological turn in legal thought around 1880 to 1920. It does not mean it's merely historical interest, and in the conclusion we will see that historical jurisprudence raises lingering questions about the proper purpose of research and writing in legal history. So to what extent should it influence the present is one of my key takeaways. To lay the foundation, this chapter will first look at historical jurisprudence in its various iterations, not only German, but as an international phenomenon. Section 2, which is actually Section 1, pardon me, which is actually Section 2 if you count the introduction. They will then be ready to describe the work done by its adherents, in particular their purpose, objects, and approaches. And Section 2, which is actually Section 3, in addition, a proper understanding of historical jurisprudence requires recognition of political implications. In Section 3, which is actually the last one, is the conclusion. Section 4 is the conclusion. It reflects upon the legitimacy of instrumentalizing legal history of current agendas. So, moving to Section 2, but it's actually Part 1 of the way he organized the chapter. It's titled Versions of Historical Jurisprudence, the Turn to History as a Transatlantic Phenomenon. So just to kind of get you excited, this is going to be one of the more chronologically based chapters, so if you really are kind of into the history in the chronological order, this should be an exciting chapter. So he says, historical jurisprudence is not monolithic, but came in a variety of forms. First in Germany, but soon other continental European countries, notably Austria, France, Hungary, Italy, and Russia, in the late 19th century, adopted historical jurisprudence, and juris turn to history even became a transatlantic phenomenon, with David Reimann, Law's History and American Legal Thought and the Transatlantic Turn to History, elucidates, is published in 2013, as well as his own work, Matthias Reimann's Historische Schule und Common Law, it's in German, published in 1993. We will focus here on the forms it took in Germany, England, and the United States. So kind of narrowing it down to the three, but I think that's kind of interesting to see how it traveled west. Even within these jurisdictions, it grew in several and sometimes very distinct branches. So it's important to note, even as in noting Germany is a big country, and there were deviations within Germany, deviations within the UK, deviations within the United States, and deviations across all the other countries as well. So, part A, in the first part here, the German historical school, variations on a theme by Savigny. So we talked a bit about Savigny in the section by Joshua Getzler, Legal History as Doctrinal History. So very, very fascinating for me, the history of Savigny and how he brought Roman law to Germany. So he says, since whole libraries have been written about the German historical school, a brief summary here will suffice, focusing on the basic features that shaped its adherents' approach. We can see Franz Uyaker, Hans Peter Haferkamp, and Peter Stein, as well as his own work. And he says the literature in German is vast, a masterfully written and almost classic, though somewhat dated overview is Wieker's particular work. So, but nonetheless, this has been covered quite extensively. But he's drawn his information from a lot of these important scholars, and it will make sense, in my opinion. So the features outlined in the school's founding father, Frederick Karl von Savigny, who lived from 1779 to 1861. In his two earlier writings, his famous anti-codification tract Von Beruf unserer sehr Vergesetzgebung und Rechtswissenschaft, published in 1814, and his introductory essay to newly established legal periodical über den Zweck dieser Zeitschrift. The principal features are, in Savigny's work, the program of a historical legal science, the view of law as custom, and the underlying concept of organicism, and with some reservation, evolution. So that's Savigny kind of draws with this, in particular, I note the organicism, that if it's organic, then therefore we must connect it with the Roman roots and connect it with history, and that's fundamentally what historical jurisprudence is. Savigny's objective was not in pursuit of legal history, but rather establishment of a historical legal science, or Geschichtliche Rechtswissenschaft, and was largely a reaction against the 18th century natural law tradition, which had relied on abstract reason and metaphysical speculation, such as Jeremy Bentham, who was covered in the previous chapter, and it must be noted the dates of Jeremy Bentham are 1748 to 1831, and Savigny is 1779 to 1861. So they did overlap in years, but Savigny is slightly younger by about 30 years. And he pursued a science of positive law based on historical understanding, and he envisaged two basic steps. First, historical research must clarify which elements of our legal heritage are still viable and useful, and casting the rest aside. And second, these elements must be brought into a systematic order reflecting their internal coherence. And the two monumental works exemplified these two basic steps in the field especially. And it was first produced, The History of Roman Law During the Middle Age, and then A System of Modern Roman Law. So a very important agenda that Savigny put forward that was adopted by many scholars following, not only in Germany but across the world. The program was not a manifestation of an abstract reason, nor the product of human volition, according to Williker, but rather inevitably the result of a historical development. Since it manifested itself through habit and usage, at its core it was a form of custom. So law comes from custom, according to Savigny. As custom, its development had a life of its own, which lay largely beyond the control of individuals. So through extrapolating that, we cannot really control this. We just have to look at history and then pick the good ones and then codify them, essentially. And the notion of law as custom entailed an idea of organic relationship between law and human life. And it was viewed as an integral and inseparable part of people's existence and tradition, and it was organically linked to surrounding culture because it emanated from the innermost character of the nation. So it's kind of something that's inevitable, organic, almost Darwinian. And it later famously called the spirit of the people, or Volksgeist. And for Savigny, the people was not a sociological or ethnic, but rather cultural concept. Thus, law had to be understood as a historical cultural phenomenon, and that is historical jurisprudence at its inception. Reminiscent of the early 19th century notions of evolution in the realm of nature, such as Marat, or of the human spirit, such as Hegel, but yet it did not use the term evolution and embraced the concept only in part. So it's not directly linked to evolution, although it may be characterized in many ways as such. But it did claim that law developed from the earlier popular forms to a state of professionalization, so that today it lay no longer in the hands of people as such, but was entrusted to the jurists. So there has been a sort of, so it's not completely evolutionary, because it has been passed on to the professionals now, according to Savigny. but it did not see law as consistently progressive path, so sometimes there have been retroactive movements. Some of his successors embraced an evolutionary understanding of the law more openly, especially at the closing decades of the 19th century under the influence of Darwin. So there are more extremists in terms of the organic, but Savigny himself evolutionary had his own reservations. The German historical school, as a fairly coherent movement, lasted roughly from its inception in the early years of the middle 19th century. In a broader sense, most of the 19th century German legal science was Savigny's heritage, so incredibly influential. His disciples developed several variations on his basic theme. In particular, historical legal science specialized along two dimensions. One was method. Some jurists concentrated mainly on historical research, while others engaged primarily in the law's systemization, but there's still much overlap. The other dimension was substance. The so-called Romanists looked at the classical Roman sources, while the so-called Germanists focused on indigenous law. The Panoptists versus German plurality, as we saw in Joshua Getzer's chapter. In section 2, which is coming up right now, we will consider only the historical dimension in both Romanist and Germanist varieties. So there are these two opposing forces, basically to sum this up, what's going to happen. There's the Roman influence, which is brought by Savigny, but then there's also the natural German law, the indigenous law, they call it in this sense, which is kind of the actual customs there, which is interesting because Savigny did believe that the Roman law did come from custom originally, but they're different customs, because customs that were made through history, through this kind of evolutionary process that had some elements of retroactiveness and has now been passed on to the professionals. So, section B, historical jurisprudence in England from Maine to Maitland and beyond. So now we'll move to England and then see the influence of historical jurisprudence there. So historical jurisprudence began half a century later in Germany. The English movement was heavily influenced by the German model, but differed in several respects. Most importantly, it was not based on a coherent theory of legal science, and it followed particular inclinations of individual scholars, and it was not, and therefore did not form a proper school. So there was no Romanist school or Pandectist school, and it connected simply by the interest in historical dimension of the law, so largely driven by individuals and who had an interest in this. It was also a much smaller group than in Germany, and it never gained mainstream status as well. And though it was distinct and influential, it was still a minority in an environment dominated by an analytical school. So, was big in the UK, or pardon me, in England, but not as big or as influential as in Germany, and more divided, but I would say less coherent. But also there was more, like in Savigny was the leading character in Germany, but then otherwise it was quite equitably placed, whereas in England it was kind of more baton pass. The opening volley was fired by Henry Summer Maine in 1822, who lived from 1822 to 1888, so only 60 years, with the publication of Ancient Law in 1861, and his objective to indicate some of the earliest ideas of mankind as they are reflected in ancient law, and to point out the relation of these ideas to modern thought. It was essentially a history of various basic legal institutions such as wills and succession, property, contract, delict, and crime and emphasis on emergence in antiquity. There are many parallels with that of Savigny's work, and it also applied abstract legal reasoning based on the ideas of Jeremy Bentham, just covered, and John Austin, who lived from 1790 to 1859. So a little bit older than Henry Summer Maine. Like Savigny, Maine proffered an alternative of a legal science grounded in historical data, and believed in organic development and in the continuity of cultural traditions, and the fact that it can be go across nations. And he also focused mainly on Roman law as well, like Savigny. Unlike Savigny, however, he emphasized progressive evolution from archaic and collective to civilized and individualistic conceptions, especially in his most famous phrase that law had moved from status to contract. And he became hugely influential, especially in the United States. Maine did. Henry Somermain. Then following that, Henry Bryce took the baton, and he lived from 1838 to 1922, followed in Maine's lead, and he also focused on antiquity and especially Roman law, and wrote in a similarly broad, raving, essayistic style, yet provided more direct comparisons between the history and law of Rome and history and law of England. So Henry Somermain was less focused on direct comparisons, whereas Bryce was. And he also was interested primarily in constitutional and political history, rather than on institutions and private law, which Henry Somermain covered. So slightly different, but also drawing from Roman roots as well. Following this, the baton was passed to Frederick William Maitland, who lived from 1850 to 1906, so actually died before James Bryce, but was born after, so a shorter lifespan. Frederick William Maitland finally turned to the English legal history proper, and he left broadly ranging, generalizing, and somewhat amateurish approaches behind under the influence of Germanist scholars across the Channel, and dug more deeply into indigenous medieval sources than anyone previously, where his magnum opus, The History of English Law Before the Time of Edward I, became the definitive work of origins and development of medieval English law. So he could be seen as the counterpart of the non-Pandectists, or the Germanists in Germany, who were looking at their own indigenous traditions rather than Roman law. That would be Frederick William Maitland. His later successor, Paul Vigondolf, lived from 1854 to 1925, so only born 4 years after, but lived 19 years longer, or 19 years after. He died 19 years after, who studied in Berlin with Heinrich Brunner in 1840 to 1915, so studied in Germany, Heinrich Brunner lived from 1840 to 1950, but at Vinogradov studied with him, and he also studied with Theodor Mommsen, also German, who lived from 1817 to 1903. And he focused not only on history and institutions of common law, but also on social conditions in medieval England. He carried English legal historiography into the 20th century, because he lived all the way to 1925, and the distinct feature of English tradition was its comparative dimension, which contrasted the most parochial German approach rooted in Savigny's idea of a specific national Volksgeist. So kind of maybe take a step back from Maitland in that it's or maybe not a step back from Maitland, but going the indigenous roots, but contrasting it with the Germanic indigenous law. Moving to section 3 of part 2, or part 1 essentially, moving to the United States, and it's titled subscript Henry Adams and His Disciples. So it says historical jurisprudence in the United States flowered in the closing decades of the 19th century, so later than that in Germany and England, in part preceding Maitland, however, so slightly delayed with England, perhaps after Maine, but preceding Maitland, and it combined elements of German and English counterparts. It thus occupied a middle ground between these two in 4 regards. It's interesting that it came last, but it kind of went in the between. And it was in the middle ground in 4 regards. First, it was a reaction against an abstract and strictly logical approach, and like Savigny's agenda directed against continental European natural law, and like Maine's approach stood in opposition to English analytical jurisprudence. Second, the American turn to history was triggered and influenced by Maine's ancient law, but subsequently drew primarily on German research. So it kind of started on Roman law, because Maine was more focused on Roman law, but then when it went to the indigenous law, it kind of looked at the German side, or German research rather. Third, its theoretical foundation was German-inspired, also based on the notion that a true science of law must be based on historical facts, but perspectives are often closer to English approach, especially where concerned comparative elements. And fourth, with almost a dozen prominent adherents and several travelers, it's still a small affair compared to its German side, but more powerful than in England, so a middle ground in terms of its influence. And it became a highly influential force in the post-bellum legal thought. So Henry Baxter Adams is the leading character in this biography, or in this historiography. in his seminal collection of essays in Anglo-Saxon law, published in 1876, where he traced common law roots to medieval England, so kind of taking the Germanic approach in that they look at the indigenous law of their own country, but in this they looked at the Anglo-Saxon law, and therefore they're studying Anglo-Saxons, but as Germanic inspired. And it influenced a sizable group of scholars in the newly established law schools on the East Coast. That's where many law schools popped up in the United States in this time, such as notably the Ivy League, for example. And then when Oliver Wendell Holmes, the most lasting frame, especially in his only book, The Common Law, published in 1881, is considered a classic in American jurisprudence, but like many classics, Mathias Reimann notes is no longer read. So perhaps that's something that if you were to read, or I have not yet read it, would give one a comparative advantage, perhaps, or it just might be fascinating, or on the other hand, maybe it's already widely enough accepted that there might be nothing to learn in it, but I doubt that. I personally have a bias towards reading the classics. I just prefer them. In terms of distinct features within the United States, particularly strong emphasis on a combative concept of evolution. Their protagonists, like Holmes, saw legal development no longer as a quiet and peaceful process of savigny, but rather a struggle between competing interests, reflecting Charles Darwin's biology, Herbert Spencer, who lived from 1820 to 1903, his social theory, and Rudolf von Jering, who lived from 1818 to 1892, his jurisprudence, also influenced the United States, and also had a strong belief in progressivism, in part due to Maine's and Darwin's influence. Perhaps also the result of a pervasive American infatuation with perpetual movement. So, as we see, the United States became the most capitalist country, one might call it, and they also wanted to constantly improve, and therefore they saw this, were drawn to perhaps Darwin's ideas of biology, or Spencer's social theory, or Jering's jurisprudence. And perhaps most distinctive feature was an emphasis on law as custom as well, which in some instances took a normative dimension with important political implications, which is kind of going back also to Savigny, because we saw law originally came from custom, but then kind of passed on its control to or needed to have its control taken off by jurists. So moving to the section, which is actually the third if you count the introduction, or at least in the textbook, the version I have, it has 3 Roman numerals, even though it's part 2. The works of historical jurisprudence, purposes, objects, and approaches. So he says, works of movements members, so multifaceted, our analysis must simplify for the confines of this chapter, using 3 general observations. So taking all 3 countries, these are the 3 general observations. While all members of the movement wrote about law from a historical perspective, not all engaged in serious historical research. Some, like James Coolidge Carter, who lived from 1827 to 1904, did virtually none. Others, like Maine and Bryce, relied almost exclusively in existing literature. The majority, de rigueur in Germany, Maitland, Vinogradov in England, and Henry Adams and his disciples in the U.S. also did this, so drawing from earlier works, which is, I guess, probably my preferred approach. In terms of the second observation, scholars focus mainly on doctrinal and institutional aspects. They research development of substantive law, mainly private, but also constitutional and criminal law, procedure, courts, and sometimes centers of learning, yet the majority paid little or no attention to law's social, political, and economic background or consequences. So that's a common theme in historical jurisprudence across these 3 countries and other countries as well, because Mathias Reimann had studied those as well. And also, third observation, there was a great deal of cross-fertilization with the German side mainly in giving and Anglo-American side on the receiving end. So it was, although it passed back and forth, it was mainly coming from Germany and received by the Anglo-American side. And the German writing inspired English as well, and Adams, and Maine influenced the Americans, who were later cited by Maitland. So there was some cross-fertilization between England and the United States. The German, English, and American scholars also correspond with other works and reviewed each other's books beginning in the 1870s and tended to see themselves as part of a common enterprise. So once again, there was quite a bit of cross-fertilization, even though it tended to be coming from Germany and received by ultimately the Anglo-Americans, and the United States kind of in the middle. But as well as we saw, the United States is also kind of the middle ground between them as well, so then there was some cross-fertilization between the US and England. So to go through these in a little bit more detail, I'll go into first A, the purposes, the goals of historical research, the notable themes. So legal historical research pursued a variety of objects which can be overlapped. They had three primary goals. One, a proper understanding of the current doctrines and institutions. Two, a comprehension of the law's evolution as a social phenomenon. And three, knowledge of the past for its own sake. So most widely shared and most characteristic purpose was to acquire deep understanding of current doctrines and institutions. Law was regarded as the product of history, and true mastery and material could be acquired only by tracing its growth from the roots all the way to the present. So there's kind of this competitive aspect of it. And most scholars agree that historical understanding enabled lawyers to clarify and refine their current doctrines. Second, the purpose of historical inquiry to understand the evolution of law more broadly as a social and cultural phenomenon. This kind of work aimed at unveiling the general features of legal development. For many, like Maine and Holmes, the principal characteristic of legal evolution was the progression from ancient and primitive to modern and development forms of law. So there's this other distinct purpose, and sometimes it even veered in the direction of legal ethnology, especially in the work of German scholars such as Joseph Kohler, who lived from 1849 to 1919, and Albert Prost, who lived from 1839 to 1895. Finally, in the closing decades of the 19th and especially the early 20th century, historical research and writing increasingly sought to acquire knowledge of legal past for its own sake, and was no longer part of historical jurisprudence proper, but turned into legal history as a discipline in its own right. So legal history as it differs from historical jurisprudence. The boundary between historical jurisprudence in legal history, often a matter of phasis, where Savigny, Carl Friedrich Eichhorn, who lived from 1781 to 1854, Pollock, and Holmes had a keen interest in laws past, but scholarship served primarily present-day purposes. By contrast, those we qualify as legal historians, Theodore Mommsen, from 1817 to 1903, Heinrich Brunner, from 1840 to 1950, and Maitland and Melville Biglow, who lived from 1846 to 1921, were cognizant of the work's modern implications, but were mainly writing legal history as such, and essentially historians looking at law. So that's how legal history differs from historical jurisprudence. Historical jurisprudence kind of has these objectives, or purposes. Now moving to section B, objects, Roman and Germanic law. So what are the objects of historical jurisprudence? It says the adherents of historical jurisprudence on both sides of the Atlantic saw their origins of their respective legal systems in ancient Roman or medieval Germanic law. So interestingly, scholars paid much less and in many instances no attention to the several other important heritages, especially the huge body of canon law, the law of merchants and its many variations, and the natural law tradition in the early modern period. So it's definitely focused mostly on ancient and medieval law in Rome and Germany, respectively. And there are some exceptions, such as Frederick William Maitland's Canon Law in England, and H.L.A. Fisher, who was an editor of the collected papers of Frederick William Maitland in 1911, also covered this. As we will see in part 3, the last section, the respective contribution of Roman and Germanic sources to the modern law of Germany, England, and the United States were subject to intense debates throughout the 19th century. Roman law also had different status in respective countries, causing its study to take different directions. In Germany, the reception of Roman law in the late Middle Ages rendered it directly applicable to many courts and the bureaucracies for the modern state, which also some, we might say, made it ripe for authoritarianism, and for centuries it dominated legal education and practice as part of its ius commune. And in the 19th century, Roman law was the core of Germany's legal system, especially in private law. Roman law has only the civil or slave law, according to Tocqueville, in the old regime and the French Revolution. You see that? And only towards the end of the 19th century, when modern legislation and eventually codification superseded the Pendekrecht, that German scholars began to write about Roman law from a truly historical perspective, as in the works of Theodor Mommsen and Otto Lenel, who lived from 1849 to 1935, and Ludwig Mathias, who lived from 1859 to 1921. In the genre of Roman legal history, Römisch Rechtsgeschichte was born and flourished mainly in the 20th century after the era of historical jurisprudence had come to an end. So basically, when historical jurisprudence kind of came into the decline, it was marked by the decline in the focus on Roman law. In England, Roman law played a limited but considerable practical role as civil law in the various contexts since the High Middle Ages. It was also as an academic home to the Regius Professorship, which existed in both Oxford and Cambridge since 1540. They still teach Roman law at Oxford and Cambridge. In the second half of the 19th century, however, it was no longer directly applicable to secular courts. Jurists still paid a fair amount of attention to Roman law, in part simply as a manifestation of a generally high regard for classical studies. So they're studying it just for the challenge or the admiration for classical studies, which is something that I have, or perhaps I'm even guilty of. Yet, to pursue for a variety of more specific purposes, some, like Maine, studied it in search of clues about ancient law, and others, like Bryce, compared its development with that of English law. So there were reasons why they focused on Roman law. Maitland mainly was interested in exploring Roman law influence in England, and finally, towards the close of the century, English study of Roman law increasingly liberated itself, as in Germany, from the present-day concerns and developed into a specialty in its own right, so it's not as popular anymore. In contrast to the situation in both Germany and England, Roman law never had a direct force in the United States, some civil law influence in the early republic notwithstanding, yet in the first half of the 19th century, Roman law enjoyed considerable attention among American gentlemen and jurists, be it because they were intrigued by Niebuhr's and Savigny's discovery of Gaius Institutes. They discovered these Gaius Institutes in 1816, and you see in Joshua Getzer's amazing chapter that Roman law is based from Caius, who influenced Justinian, because they operated on the classicalist culture of slaveholding Old South. So it kind of fit, because as we said, Roman law is, or according to de Tocqueville, is a slave law, or simply because they cultivated Roman law as a matter of higher learning, as we saw in England. After the American Civil War, however, the broader interest quickly waned. As American law matured, Roman law, by and large, lost its practical utility. Some did keep an eye on it, perhaps most visible in its case of Holmes. The interest was not for its own sake, but instrumental. Like Maitland in England, it looked at Roman law mainly in order to gauge its role in their own legal tradition. So different influence of Roman law in all three jurisdictions. The other main field of historical jurist research consisted of the mass of indigenous or non-Roman law, so indigenous German, indigenous Anglo-Saxon, and indigenous law, as we have in Canada. The United States would be First Nations law, but that's not actually what Mathias Reimann means here. That had developed from the folk law, at least allegedly, in the early and high Middle Ages, variously called German and more broadly Germanic or Teutonic law. In Germany, part of the historical school's original agenda, in the first half of the 19th century, it worked in spirit of historical jurisprudence guided by present-day purposes, and like the Romanists, it aimed at building a systemic system, so it had the similar or same objective as that of the Romanic area. In their case, the German private law was particularly applicable, yet many Germanists already looked at the past largely in and of itself, sometimes blending their approach with general historical as well as philological and linguistic studies, most famously in the case of Jacob Grimm, who lived from 1785 to 1862. After the middle of the century, scholars increasingly turned to the history of German law for its own sake, and covered not only earlier Frankish and later German heartlands, but also the Nordic regions, and notably Anglo-Saxon England, the work of Felix Liebermann in 1851 to 1925. By the time it came into vogue in England and the United States, these German jurists had already produced a substantial body of sophisticated scholarship on their law's indigenous roots. So kind of like pushing back, as we saw previously, against the Pandectists, focusing on German law in its own right. This, as well as the originality and quality of their work, put them in the leading position vis-a-vis their common law colleagues, even with regard to medieval English law. So, also picked up in the United States and England. On the other side of the channel, a completely different picture, however. Well into the last third of the 19th century, English legal historiography was either rather superficially or virtually non-existent. Maine occasionally touched on it, but by no means was a historian of English law. Maitland famously lamented as late as 1888 that the history of English law was not written. For the time being, it was largely left to Germans and under their influence. And since the mid-1870s, and then to the Americans, this began to change only in the 1880s. With Maitland an outburst of scholarly production, master of both doctrinal and social contextualized legal history, made up about 2 short decades what the generation before him had neglected. So Maitland, not Maine, really brought the indigenous spirit to England. Pardon me. And he drew heavily on both German and U.S. American scholarship, but delved deeply into original sources himself. So, contrasting Maine, he did believe it was written and did find it, supposedly. Most important works, The History of English Law Before the Time of Edward I, published in 1895, and Doomsday Book and Beyond, published in 1897, are widely regarded as the greatest books ever written on English legal history. But not Roman laws, perhaps, but English legal history, caveat, pure legal history, and thus lie beyond historical jurisprudence proper. Same is true for Maitland's successor on the field of medieval legal history, Paul Vinogradov. In the U.S., English legal history began to be written a decade before Maitland, 1870s, and the signal event was the publication in 1876 by young Henry Baxter Adams of a collection of essays in Anglo-Saxon law, written by himself and his students, and over the next 3 decades, a dozen of ultimately prominent American writers produced a substantial body of literature on the medieval origins and the genesis of common law, often comparing it with other legal cultures, especially the Roman. Most scholars interested in the past primarily in order to better the understanding of the present of law in the present, such as James Barr Ames, who lived from 1846 to 1910, James Bradley Thayer, lived from 1831 to 1902, John Norton Pomeroy, who lived from 1828 to 1885, and some, however, pursued legal history mainly for its own sake, such as Henry Adams, who lived from 1850 to 1901, and Melville Biglow, who lived from 1846 to 1921, whose work then inspired Maitland. So we can see that in some ways the United States started studying indigenous law, as we called it in this context, before Maitland in England brought it. Despite the considerable diversity, work done by Germanists in Germany, by Maitland, Vinogradov, and a few others in England, and by Adams and his followers in the U.S. can justly be regarded as a distinct transnational body of scholarship on early and medieval Germanic and English law, especially true in light of the academic relationships, influences, and references across the national boundaries. By beginning of the 20th century, the body of scholarship was rich, mature, and on the whole of high quality. It constitutes perhaps the most enduring heritage of historical jurisprudence. So, but it must be noted, I guess, in this section that the Americans, in terms of the indigenous law, were primarily still studying Anglo-Saxon law, so it could be seen as English law heritage. And then C, the final section of this section, method, back to the original sources. So historical jurisprudence saw itself as a form of science based on the observation of concrete, in this case historical facts, which from the principles could be distilled by inductive reasoning. It was an approach mandated working with the original sources and studying them with careful attention to detail. For example, Savigny took the lead in Germany by traveling far and wide to various archives and digging up original documents, especially for his history of the Roman law in the Middle Ages. And among his successors, he became de rigueur, to work from sources themselves. So de rigueur, they work hard and they actually go to the original sources, and it's been a common theme, both on the Romanist and Germanist side. In the U.S., Adams and his followers took after the Germans in the 1870s, and shortly thereafter, Maitland and Vinogradov joined the bandwagon in England. But the picture is not entirely uniform in that sense, but they do. Historical jurisprudence does have a focus on original texts. Not everybody cut their nose to the ground, such as Maine and Bryce showed little interest in getting their hands dusty in archives. Maitland and Bryce in England, and Kohler and Post in Germany painted a much broader approach, where the mainstream Germans and American influenced, and Maitland known for their exactness of detail. Some jurists, most notably Holmes, combined the study of the original sources with heavy reliance on secondary literature and mixed meticulous attention to detail with broad theorizing. So there's been some, not everyone was going to the original sources, but some went secondary to people who had already gone to the original sources in the first place. So, and then some also applied secondary sources, which are also can often be just as important. In addition to writing monographs and articles, many historical jurists made particularly lasting contributions by editing and publishing a multitude of original sources, so they also did work on the original sources themselves. And again, the Germans took the lead in the early 19th century with the ambitious project Monumenta Germanae Historica, founded in 1819, and Johann Friedrich Ludwig Goschen's edition of Gaius's Institutes in 1820. So actually republishing Gaius's Institutes, probably the oldest formal book of law that we have. And also there are, he says, even too many to mention in this vein. In 1870s, common lawyers began in suit, with William Stubbs' Select Charter and Other Illustrations of English Constitutional History, published in 1870, and Melville Biglow, much noted edition of Palacita Anglo-Normannica, published in 1879. And most importantly, 1887, Maitland founded the Selden Society, under whose auspices subsequently edited and published a significant number of original sources, like the Monumenta Germanae Historica. The Selden Society had continues to operate to the present, so they're still developing these original sources, which personally, as I said, I do have a bias for the original sources. Could be wrong in that sense, but I do for the original sources. So moving to the last section, section 4, which is actually part 3 of the chapter, but so the political implications, a common theme, as we'll see with that chapter by Philip Schofield. Political implications, legal traditions, lawmaking, and laissez-faire are the 3 political implications. Historical jurisprudence was not a purely academic matter, but also had political implications, he says. In particular, adherents fought about the identity of their legal traditions, were worried about the distribution of lawmaking powers, and their evolutionary view of law often supported laissez-faire politics. So starting with the first, identity, section A, the struggle for the soul of law. So focus on legal traditions. So for most of the 19th century, he says, jurists in the 3 countries considered here struggled with an identity crisis. They were the essential character of their respective legal traditions as either indigenous or Roman in Germany, or whether Roman law had a significant influence because they were entirely beyond Kabyle. Instead, the struggle was the extent of that influence. So kind of, there's always been this pushback, as we saw in the Joseph Getzler chapter, against the Pandectists, where is the Roman law taking over? It was suddenly too influential. And surely in private law, this also had applications. But the Germanists sought to show the important elements of present-day law had on medieval German roots, for example, in the area of corporations, banking, and negotiations interests. And secondly, the desirability of the Roman influence. So the Romans were, those pushing for the Romans were not as kind of worried about this. It was kind of more on the Germanist side. The Germanists felt increasingly marginalized and eventually became to oppose the reign of Roman law altogether, so it became quite heated. Romanists linked with the monarchy as well and the bureaucracy, and it was also more individualistic too, so there were also more political elements as well. In the Anglo-American orbit, The main issue was more fundamental, whether common law was significantly shaped by Roman influence at all, or whether it was essentially cut from indigenous, i.e. Anglo-Saxon cloth. In the early mid-19th century, many scholars of both countries advocated for the former position, and beginning in the 1870s, the tide began to turn and charge against Romanist view of common law. Most prominently, Holmes began this, and the link between U.S. and England perhaps was recovering at this time, and perhaps also the link was that maybe the English law was more prestigious. That was according to Getzler, for example, and I think Reimann is also implying this, but I cannot say for certain. In terms, or that the what I'm saying here is the Americans kind of perhaps favored some of the English over the Roman or even Germanic, because there was some kind of underlying connection. The next political implication: lawmaking, legislation versus legal science. So historical jurisprudence invited opposition to legislation, in the fact that if the essential nature of law was not, as the analytical jurists had postulated, the command of the sovereign, but rather the product of the longue durée historical evolution, the law lay largely beyond ad hoc will, and arguably beyond the power of the legislator. So if it is organic, if it is evolutionary, then there's no place for the jurists. Thus, historical jurists tended to be skeptical or even hostile towards statutory lawmaking, albeit to varying degrees. The most visible is the respective debates about codification, as Savigny famously and for the time being successfully argued against a German civil code of the 19th century. So James Coolidge Carter campaigned also successfully against the project of the New York Civil Code in its closing decade. So they don't want to codify these things because they think it will block off the evolution, and that would be along Savigny's kind of in favor of not making laws in this sense. In their view, a code certainly should not and could not change the law. Codification of status quo was harmful because it could stunt law's natural growth from custom and was too delicate for politicians. The third trend: conservatism and liberalism, a laissez-faire preference. Section C. So hostility towards legislators, also fueled by dislike of radical change and aversion to state regulation in private affairs. It was inherently a conservative movement in the sense of preferring slow evolution over abrupt changes. Savigny's historical school emphasized continuity with the past and flirted with romanticism, and common lawyers practice of reasoning from the past rather than the future. Agendas render their mode conservative as well. Yet there are exceptions, such as like Holmes and Maitland, who were quite open to legal change. Also, it was often went hand in glove with classical 19th century liberalism as well, in that it was highly skeptical of state interference with private rights. Savigny's reaction against the paternalistic tradition, continental Europe's Enlightenment monarchies denied that the world can be fundamentally helped by regulation and government, and bemoaned the rage to govern, especially Anglo-American orbit, and believed legal systems left unto themselves would automatically develop towards a liberal order. So once again, laissez-faire and kind of against lawmaking and codification as well. Main's from status to contract also emphasizes laissez-faire, and the Romanists created the framework for the free market society as well. As Anglo-American jurists presented their common law as appropriate regime for a capitalist economy, with strong property rights, extensive freedom of contract, and restricted tort liability, particularly for industrial accidents, Adam Smith's invisible hand also influenced this laissez-faire trend that characterized historical jurisprudence in all three of these countries. They were not blind to the excesses of capitalism, even in the U.S., and not as broadly committed to laissez-faire politics as those such as Roscoe Pound later claimed. So, although they did have this laissez-faire and sort of conservative, but at the same time liberal element as well, they were not too strong. They were not too politically driven by this. In fact, they kind of all went in different directions anyways, as Mathias Reimann notes. So, lastly, for the conclusion, so it's titled The Instrumentalization of Legal History. So historical jurisprudence petered out, he says, between the 1880s and the First World War. Some notable publications were even after 1914, but the aftermath mostly collecting or reprinting earlier works. By 1920, historical jurisprudence was legal history. Movement's decline and fall had several reasons. Some were country-specific. For example, in Germany, Rudolf von Jhering launched a devastating critique against the historical school and pushed jurisprudence towards a sociological approach. In 1900, it enacted the BGB, which was the German civil code. Cut private law largely off from the past. So by codification, kind of stopped this necessity of historical jurisprudence. In England, Maitland's death in 1906 marked the beginning of the erstwhile decline of historical scholarship, as neither he nor Paul Vinogradov trained successors who could continue their work. So the different cause of decline in the United States. In the United States, legal thought turned towards pragmatism, and under the leadership of Roscoe Pound, himself influenced by Jhering, embraced sociological jurisprudence rather than historical jurisprudence. In addition, the First World War ended the cooperation between German and Anglo-American legal scholars, but two deeper reasons for the movement's demise that were common in all three countries were the backward-looking conceptions of law. Historical jurisprudence was fundamentally at odds with the forward-looking agendas of the 20th century regulatory state, or the liberal movement. History did not provide solutions for problems of industrialization, labor conflict, and urbanization. With the claim that law as a science belonged in the hands of trained legal experts, historical jurisprudence was essentially undemocratic, and legislators, not legal scientists, called the shots. So which is kind of a sociological trend in the 20th century caused this. So what has survived is legal historiography in its own right. Having gradually divorced itself from historical jurisprudence from the last century, legal historians have pursued knowledge of the past for its own sake, not in aid of current agendas. Most notably, Maine, Holmes, and Carter provide telltale evidence of the selective bias of distorted interpretation. In recognition, Maitland warned contemporaries that if we try to make legal history the handmaid of dogma, she will soon cease to be history. So it's now just moved to historiography, or just legal history generally, just legal history for the sake of legal history. In contrast to civil law colleagues, common law lawyers still often think about present-day law in historical terms. However, the product is not only of present legislative or judicial will, but also from a long tradition. Legal history pursued for its own sake has not eliminated legal history serving current practice, so there is still room for historical jurisprudence, particularly in common law countries. Mathias notes that there is no reason why this should not, he say, be possible in civil law orbit as well. It is imperative, but as we see in Marcus Dubber's chapter, that the civil law is moving into interdisciplinarity, so it might actually, whereas common law is moving towards doctrinalism, which I think aligns more with historical jurisprudence, particularly the Roman side, but also the indigenous side as well. Lastly, he says it's imperative to recognize that these two forms of legal history are different enterprises, that is, civil law and common law, which must be carefully separated. Maitland saw clearly over a century ago by warning we must not mix two different logics, the logic of authority, civil law, the logic of evidence, common law. What the lawyer wants is authority for his position, what the historian wants is evidence of past realities. Indicated, if this mistake is avoided, historical jurisprudence can peacefully coexist with a purist approach concerned with practical utility. Whether to what extent and even how purely academic legal history can contribute to the present-day lawmaking and legal practice is, of course, an entirely different question, and he says this is beyond the scope of this chapter. But I, as someone who's fascinated in history, I hope that historical jurisprudence will remain, and I think it will, and I think it is, and I think there's more ways that are perhaps even hidden. So, moving to the content of the slide, and then we'll talk more about Mathias Reimann in the comparison with Philip. Okay, so his institution, University of Michigan Law School. Philip Schofield, pardon me, I should have said the last name wrong. Dr. Philip Schofield. So moving back to Mathias Reimann, his institution, the University of Michigan Law School, his position, Hessel E. Netma, Professor of Law. His areas of interest are international and comparative law and litigation, and his recent courses include gun control, international litigation, jurisdiction and choice of law, and transnational law. His suggested readings include the International Encyclopedia of Comparative Law, published by Brill and Niejoff in 2020, the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Law, published by the Oxford University Press in 2019, not long before the Oxford Handbook of Legal History that we are covering, and also with Halberstam, Daniel H., Federalism and Legal Unification, a comparative and empirical investigation of 20 systems, published by Springer Dordrecht in 2014. In terms of the symbols, we have the University of Freiburg at the bottom, where you see most of his degrees, and he taught his professor as well. And above that, we have the University of Michigan, where he currently teaches and where he also received his Master of Law, his LLM. In terms of the quotes, we have historical jurisprudence treated law as inevitably a product of the past. Next quote, historical jurisprudence was largely a 19th century phenomenon. It must thus be seen in the context of the times. Next quote, third quote, historical jurisprudence was not a purely academic matter, but also had considerable political implications. In particular, its adherents fought about the identity of their legal traditions, worried about the distribution of lawmaking power, and with their evolutionary views of law often supported laissez-faire politics. So those three trends. What has survived in legal historiography in its own right is legal historiography in its own right, having gradually divorced itself from historical jurisprudence. For the last century, legal historians have pursued knowledge of the past for its own sake, not in aid of current agendas. But who knows, it might pick up again, and I hope it does as someone who enjoys history. So, moving to the comparison between Philip Schofield and Mathias Reimann in the style of Plutarch's Lives, to learn a little bit more of them. So, in terms of comparison, so Philip Schofield, his academic career, started in Manchester and then moved to London, whereas Mathias Reimann started in Freiburg and moved to Michigan. So, none of their countries actually overlap, even though Mathias Reimann has taught in many different countries. Their major moves have been in different regions. Notably, Philip Schofield has moved but maintained within the United Kingdom, or England specifically, whereas Mathias Reimann has moved across continents. And they both have a law degrees as well as a Master of Laws and a PhD. So educationally, they're quite similar, however, very different institutions. In terms of the scholarship, Philip Schofield is probably the forefront leading intellectual on Bentham specifically, whereas Mathias Reimann covers historical jurisprudence more broadly. So while he knows a lot about Savigny, for example, Maitland, Maine, and Adams, he's perhaps not as focused on any one of them as Philip Schofield is. In fact, they both, they did both, in terms of their chapters, or perhaps where they differ, as Philip Schofield says there's perhaps a lot of work still to be done, and he endeavors to do it, whereas Mathias Reimann did sort of indicate that historical jurisprudence might be on the decline, but in my estimation, I think it might pick up again, or I think at least in my former scholarship, or what I'm fascinated in, I think there is a lot to be learned and applied to the present. But I think Mathias Reimann did sort of indicate that his area had been in the decline and may presently be in the decline. But they both do indicate that there is plenty of more opportunity. They are both historians, which is something that distinguishes them specifically from almost most other lawyers. But they're both not that I've seen have significant careers practicing law. They're mostly stuck to academia, but they're both also very prolific writers too. Despite being a little bit different in age, they've both written many books and many chapters and many book reviews, and are both very, very prolific in that sense. So that is the comparison and biographies and respective chapters of Philip Schofield and Mathias Reimann. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you so much for supporting.